May 1944, Kent, England. In a muddy field 3 miles from the white cliffs of Dover, Corporal Tommy Henderson of the Fort Garry Horse, a Canadian armoured regiment, stood next to what looked like a massive 33-ton Sherman tank. The morning sun glinted off its olive drab paint. Mud streaked its tracks. Oil stains marked the ground beneath it. From 20 feet away, it looked absolutely real. But when Henderson placed his hands on the turret and pushed, the entire tank rocked gently in the spring breeze. It weighed 63 pounds. It was made of rubberized canvas stretched over a wooden frame and filled with air from a gasoline-powered compressor. And it was about to help win the war. Henderson was part of a secret Canadian unit working with British engineers to deploy hundreds of these inflatable tanks across southeast England. The mission was simple but crucial. Make the Germans believe a massive invasion force was gathering near Dover, preparing to strike across the narrowest part of the English Channel to Pas-de-Calais in France. Make Hitler send his panzer divisions there to wait. Meanwhile, the real invasion force would gather 200 miles west and strike at Normandy instead. Everything depended on fooling German reconnaissance pilots into photographing fake tanks and reporting them as real. If the deception failed, if the Germans figured out the truth, thousands of Allied soldiers would die on the beaches. The problem was enormous and terrifying. Everyone knew an invasion was coming. The Germans knew it. Hitler knew it. The only questions were when and where. German intelligence had been watching England for months, trying to identify where the massive Allied force would cross the Channel. They flew reconnaissance missions whenever Allied fighters gave them an opening. Every photograph was analyzed by expert intelligence officers in Berlin who had been studying Allied tactics since 1939. They counted tanks in aerial photos. They tracked troop movements. They identified unit patches and vehicle markings, and they were very good at their jobs. By March of 1944, German intelligence had correctly identified dozens of real Allied units gathering in southern England. The picture was becoming dangerously clear. If the Germans discovered the real landing site, they could position their panzer divisions at exactly the right beaches and wait. Allied planners had run the calculations, and the numbers were nightmare fuel. If German tanks were positioned correctly when the invasion came, casualties in the first wave could jump from 30% to 70%. That meant instead of 30,000 men killed or wounded on D-Day, it could be 70,000. The invasion could collapse in blood and chaos within hours. Years of planning would be wasted. The war could drag on until 1947 or beyond. Millions more would die. The margin between victory and catastrophe was measured in whether the Germans believed a lie. British and American commanders had tried every conventional deception method they knew. They built wooden mock-ups of tanks and painted camouflage patterns on canvas stretched over truck frames. They constructed fake headquarters buildings with plywood walls. They even hired Hollywood set designers to create dummy landing craft from timber and canvas. But these early attempts had serious problems. Wooden tanks were too heavy, weighing 240 pounds each. Moving them required trucks and created obvious tire tracks that looked nothing like tank treads. Setting them up took 4 hours with a full crew. And worst of all, they looked fake in photographs. German photo analysts spotted them easily. The shadows fell wrong. The weathering looked too uniform. Real tanks left specific types of tracks and oil stains. Fake tanks sat too perfect, too clean. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in London, officers argued desperately about how to solve the problem. One British general wanted to move actual divisions to southeast England to make the deception look real. but that would weaken the real invasion force gathering in Portsmouth and Southampton. An American colonel suggested building even bigger and better wooden fakes, but that just meant more obvious fakes that German analysts would spot. The conventional solutions were not working, and D-Day was coming whether they were ready or not. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. British engineers working in North Africa had experimented with inflatable tanks during deception operations against Rommel in 1942 and 1943. The early versions were crude, just rubber balloons painted green, but they had proven one critical point. From the air, at 20,000 feet, a well-made inflatable could fool a camera if you got the details right. The key was not making it perfect. The key was making it look real enough in a photograph taken from 4 miles up by a plane traveling 300 miles per hour. Human eyes seeing it on the ground would know immediately it was fake. But German pilots in planes taking quick photos through breaks in cloud cover would see only shapes and shadows. In January 1944, British and Canadian engineers formed a joint team to mass-produce military-grade inflatable decoys. They studied real Sherman tanks in minute detail. Every dimension had to match exactly. A real Sherman measured 19 feet 2 inches long and 8 feet 7 inches wide. The inflatable had to match those numbers perfectly, or German photo analysts would notice the proportions were wrong. Inside the rubber shell, they added 14 wooden battens positioned at precise angles. These battens were crucial. They held the fabric in exactly the right shape so shadows fell correctly. A real tank has hard edges, sharp corners, a gun barrel at a specific angle. When sun hits it from above, the shadow has a particular look that trained analysts recognize. The battens made sure the inflatable cast the same shadow. But dimensions and shadows were not enough. The Canadians added the weathering details that made the deception work. They studied real Canadian armored units training in England and noted how tanks got dirty. Mud splashed in specific patterns on the treads and lower hull. Dust settled on horizontal surfaces. Rain created streaks down the sides. Oil and grease leaked from hatches and left dark stains. They painted all of it onto the rubber, making each inflatable tank look like it had been in the field for weeks. They even used bulldozers to create realistic tank tracks in the mud around each fake position, carving deep treads that matched how 33 tons of steel would compress the earth. The Canadians were perfect for this mission. 1st Canadian Army had been stationed in southeast England since late 1943. Canadian soldiers were already a visible presence in Kent and Sussex. German intelligence had spotted Canadian unit patches and identified Canadian divisions in the area. The Germans expected Canadians to be part of any invasion force. So when Canadian engineers started positioning inflatable tanks in fields near Dover, it fit perfectly with what German intelligence already believed. The Phantom Army would look like a real buildup of Canadian armored strength preparing to cross from Dover to Calais, exactly what the Germans feared most. Corporal Henderson looked across the field where his crew had just finished setting up 12 inflatable Shermans in tactical positions. From where he stood, they looked absurd. He could see the fabric rippling slightly in the wind. He knew each one could be lifted by 4 men and carried away. But he also knew German reconnaissance pilots would be flying over any day now, cameras clicking, taking photos that would go back to Berlin. And in those photos, shot from 20,000 feet through breaks in the clouds, these rubber tanks would look like the real thing. They would look like Canada was bringing its armored divisions to Kent. They would look like an invasion force gathering. And that lie, that carefully crafted visual deception, could save thousands of Canadian lives, when the real invasion came at a beach the Germans were not watching. Corporal Henderson found his key partner in Lieutenant William Thornton of the Royal Canadian Engineers, a practical man who had worked as a stage manager at the Stratford Festival in Ontario before the war. Thornton understood something most military officers did not. Deception was not about creating perfect replicas. It was about controlling what the audience saw and making them believe what you wanted them to believe. Together, they worked through February and March of 1944 in a warehouse near Shepperton Studios, the same facility where British film crews had once built movie sets. Now, instead of building castles and pirate ships, they were building an army made of rubber and air. The technical problems were harder than Henderson expected. A real Sherman tank was not just a simple shape. It had hundreds of small details that made it recognizable. The turret sat at a specific angle. The gun barrel extended exactly 42 inches beyond the turret front. The track bogies had a particular spacing pattern. The exhaust pipes sat in exact positions on the rear deck. The antenna mount was positioned 12 inches behind the commander's hatch. Miss any of these details, and German photo analysts would spot the fake immediately. These analysts had been studying Allied equipment for years. They knew what a Sherman looked like from every angle. They could identify variants by small differences in turret shape or track design. Thornton and his team settled on a 3-layer rubberized canvas material, precisely 0.8 of a millimeter thick. Any thinner and the fabric would tear when inflated. Any thicker and it would be too stiff to fold properly and too heavy to transport easily. Inside the shell, the 14 wooden battens were positioned using measurements taken from actual Sherman tanks parked at Canadian training grounds. Each batten was cut to exact specifications. The one supporting the turret edge had to be positioned at precisely 37 degrees from vertical. The battens holding the gun barrel shape had to maintain a 1-degree upward angle to match how real Shermans carried their guns. Get these angles wrong by even 2 degrees, and the shadows in aerial photographs would look wrong to trained German eyes. They painted the rubber skin using exact color-matching olive drab paint, mixed to the same formula the Canadian Army used on real tanks. But Thornton added something the original British designs lacked. He studied Canadian armoured units that had been training in muddy English fields for months and photographed how real tanks weathered. He noticed mud always splashed highest on the left front fender, where the left track threw it. He saw that oil leaked from engine compartments and created specific drip patterns down the rear hull. He observed that rain washed dust off curved surfaces, but left it in recessed areas around hatches and vision ports. He photographed rust patterns on bare metal edges where paint had chipped away. Then he reproduced all of it on the inflatables. His team painted fake mud splashes using darker paint mixed with actual dirt from Kent Fields. They created oil stain patterns using black paint thinned with kerosene. They added rust effects around painted hatch edges using orange and brown pigments. They even painted on the worn patches where tank crews climbed on and off the hull, areas where boots had rubbed away the paint over time. When they finished, each inflatable tank looked like it had been in field service for 6 months. From the ground up close, you could tell it was fake. From 20,000 feet through a camera lens, it looked like a well-used Canadian Sherman tank. But Thornton had no official authorization to deploy these decoys yet. In early March, Supreme Headquarters was still debating whether inflatable deceptions would work against German intelligence. Some officers worried the Germans would spot them easily. Others argued that without German aircraft flying regular reconnaissance over England, there was no point in building physical decoys at all. Thornton decided to run an unauthorized test. On March 14th, he and Henderson set up 6 inflatable Shermans in a field near Camberley, mixing them with real tanks from the Canadian Armoured Corps. They positioned them in standard defensive hull-down positions, with only the turrets visible above earth berms. Then Thornton called in a favor from the Royal Canadian Air Force. He asked reconnaissance pilots to photograph the Camberley position exactly as they would photograph German positions in France. High-altitude photos from 20,000 feet. Standard reconnaissance cameras. No special instructions. The pilots flew the mission on March 16th, a clear morning with good visibility. They took 47 photographs of the area and brought the film back for development. 2 days later, Thornton sat with 3 Royal Air Force photo interpreters in a small office at RAF Benson. These men were experts, trained to analyze every detail in reconnaissance photographs. Their job was to look at photos of enemy territory and identify real equipment versus decoys. They had seen thousands of images. They knew every German trick for camouflaging real tanks and every Allied trick for making fake ones. Thornton watched their faces as they examined the Camberley photographs through magnifying glasses. One interpreter tapped a spot on the photo with his pencil. Sherman, tank here. Hull down position behind this berm. Well camouflaged, but visible. He marked it with a grease pencil. Another interpreter pointed to 3 more shapes. 3 more here, spread across this tree line. Standard defensive spacing. I'd estimate this is a full tank troop, probably 12 vehicles total in this sector. He marked those as well. 4 of the 6 inflatables had been identified as real tanks by expert photo interpreters. Thornton let them finish their analysis. Then he told them the truth. 4 of those tanks you marked are rubber balloons filled with air. They weigh 63 pounds each. 2 men can carry one. The room went silent. One interpreter actually laughed, thinking it was a joke. Then he saw Thornton's serious expression and stopped laughing. He picked up the magnifying glass and examined the photographs again, searching for any sign that would reveal which tanks were real and which were rubber. Even knowing the truth, even looking specifically for signs of deception, he could not tell the difference in the photographs. Word of the test reached Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory within 48 hours. Leigh-Mallory commanded Allied air forces preparing for the invasion and understood the strategic values of deception. When he saw the test photographs and the photo interpreters' reports confirming they had been fooled, he recognized this could change the entire invasion plan. If British experts looking specifically for signs of fakery could not spot inflatable tanks in photographs, German analysts looking at stolen reconnaissance photos would have no chance. This was not just a clever trick. This was a weapon that could multiply Allied strength without building a single real tank. Leigh-Mallory went directly to General Dwight Eisenhower with the evidence. He brought the photographs, the interpreter's analysis, and Thornton's cost projections. An inflatable Sherman tank cost 11 pounds to manufacture. A real Sherman cost 7,800 pounds. For the price of one real tank, they could build over 700 fakes. Eisenhower studied the photos and asked the critical question: how many can we deploy before D-Day? Thornton had already worked out the answer. With Canadian and British production facilities working together, they could manufacture 600 inflatable tanks by May. They could create the visual appearance of an entire armored division, 12,000 men and 300 tanks, using fewer than 100 real soldiers to deploy and maintain the decoys. In late March, Thornton received official authorization to proceed with full-scale production and deployment. Canadian engineers and infantrymen began arriving at Dover from units across England. Most were never told the complete truth about their mission. They received orders to report to a special camouflage unit working on deception operations. They were shown how to unpack the inflatables from their canvas duffel bags, how to connect the gasoline-powered air compressors, how to position the wooden battens correctly during inflation. They learned that each tank took exactly 14 minutes to inflate and position properly. They were told that precision mattered more than speed, that lives depended on making every detail look exactly right. The first major deployment began on April 18th. 40 Canadian soldiers moved into positions across Kent and Sussex, with trucks loaded with rolled-up rubber tanks. They worked primarily at night to avoid being seen by locals. Each crew of 4 men could handle one inflatable. They would arrive at a pre-selected position after dark, unroll the tank, connect the compressor, and inflate it. While it inflated, other crew members used bulldozers to create realistic tank tracks leading to the position. They scattered equipment around the site, empty fuel cans, ammunition crates marked with Canadian unit insignia, camouflage netting that was deliberately worn and dirty, small details that made the scene look like a real tank position that crews were trying to camouflage. By April 25th, 48 inflatable Sherman tanks sat in tactical positions across southeast England. They were arranged in groups matching how Canadian armoured units would actually deploy. 4 tank troops, 3 troops to a squadron, 3 squadrons to a regiment. The spacing matched Canadian doctrine. The positioning matched defensive tactics. Everything looked exactly like 1st Canadian Army was concentrating armored strength near Dover in preparation for a channel crossing. German reconnaissance pilots took the bait. On April 27th, a lone Luftwaffe Focke-Wulf 1R-90 managed to slip through Allied fighter patrols and flew a high-speed run over Kent at 22,000 feet. The pilot's cameras clicked rapidly, capturing dozens of images before British Spitfires forced him to flee. The film went back to Germany. Intelligence officers in Berlin developed it, studied it carefully, and filed their reports. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park intercepted the German signals. Intelligence that followed. The reports were clear and confident. German intelligence had identified substantial Canadian armored concentration in Kent, estimated strength of at least 2 tank regiments, possibly more. The rubber balloons filled with air had been catalogued as real 33-ton steel tanks by the best photo analysts in the German military. By early May, over 100 inflatable tanks sat in positions across southeast England. Canadian soldiers moved them periodically, creating the impression that units were shifting positions and training for an invasion. They used bulldozers to create fresh tank tracks. They set up fake maintenance areas with camouflage netting. They even positioned inflatable trucks and jeeps around the tank sites to complete the illusion. Every detail added to the deception. Every element made the phantom Canadian armored force look more real. British intelligence monitored German responses obsessively. The intercepted communication showed the deception working beyond anyone's hopes. German analysts had complete confidence in their assessments. They knew Canadian tanks were in Kent because their reconnaissance photos showed them clearly. They knew the force was growing because new photos showed additional tanks arriving. They reported these findings directly to German high command. Hitler and his generals studied the intelligence and made their strategic decisions based on it. The German 15th Army, 18 divisions, including powerful panzer units with Tiger and Panther tanks, remained positioned near Pas de Calais. Those divisions stayed there, watching the coast opposite Dover, waiting for the Canadian armoured thrust they believed was coming. And it was all because young Canadians in muddy English fields kept inflating rubber tanks and making them look real enough to fool cameras in the sky. The numbers told the story of what happened next. In March of 1944, German intelligence assessed Pas-de-Calais as the most likely invasion site with 72% probability. They based this assessment on geography, military logic, and early reconnaissance reports showing Allied buildup in southeast England. By June 5th, the day before, D-Day, that assessment had climbed to 87% certainty. German High Command intelligence reports specifically cited photographic evidence of Canadian armoured concentrations in Kent, with estimated strength of 300 tanks and supporting vehicles. Every single one of those tanks was rubber and air. Every vehicle in those reconnaissance photographs was an inflatable decoy positioned and maintained by Canadian soldiers. The deception had completely reshaped German understanding of where the invasion would strike. Production and deployment of fake equipment ramped up dramatically as D-Day approached. By late May, British factories and Canadian engineering units had produced and deployed 574 inflatable tanks across southeast England. These were not just Shermans. The inventory included inflatable Churchill tanks, inflatable artillery pieces, inflatable supply trucks, and inflatable jeeps. But the deception went far beyond the inflatables themselves. Thornton and his Canadian crews created complete fake tank parks and motor pools. They positioned the inflatable vehicles in precise military formations. They used bulldozers to carve deep track patterns in the mud connecting each position, making it look like tanks had been moving between locations during training exercises. They scattered empty fuel drums and ammunition crates around each site. They set up camouflage netting that looked worn and weathered. They even created fake laundry lines with uniforms hanging to dry, suggesting tank crews were living in field positions nearby. The Canadians also built fake convoys along the roads of Kent. These were the most visible part of the deception. Inflatable trucks were positioned on roadsides in groups of 20 or 30, arranged to look like military convoys that had pulled over for rest stops. Canadian soldiers would periodically move these fake convoys a few miles down the road, creating the impression of constant military traffic moving toward Dover and the coast. German reconnaissance flights photographed these convoys repeatedly. The intelligence reports described heavy Canadian military traffic consistent with a major force preparing for amphibious operations. At the same time, the Americans deployed their own physical deceptions using their 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the unit that would become famous as the Ghost Army. The American approach was similar but focused on different areas. They used inflatables extensively in France after D-Day to simulate entire divisions moving to different locations, drawing German forces away from real American positions. But during the pre-invasion deception in England, the Canadian-led operations in Kent and Sussex formed the primary visual component of the Phantom 1st United States Army Group that German intelligence believed was preparing to invade Calais. Before the Canadian Ghost Army created this visual deception, the situation had been increasingly desperate. The Allies needed to concentrate their real invasion force along the south coast of England between Portsmouth and Plymouth. That was where the embarkation ports were located. That was where the ships and landing craft were staged. But gathering 39 divisions, hundreds of thousands of men, and thousands of real tanks in that area made them vulnerable to German intelligence. You cannot hide that much military force. The camps were too large. The tank parks were too obvious. The supply dumps stretched for miles. Even without regular aerial reconnaissance, German agents and intelligence analysis would eventually identify where the real army was gathering. Conventional military deception had proven too limited. Standard doctrine said you camouflage your real forces and create fake forces elsewhere to draw enemy attention. But camouflaging entire armies was impossible in southern England. The area was too small, too populated, too closely observed. Moving real units back and forth to create confusion exhausted the troops and disrupted invasion preparations. Before the inflatable deceptions, Allied planners had faced what seemed like an impossible problem. They needed Germans looking away from Normandy, but they had no effective way to make that happen. The inflatable ghost army changed everything. Now the Allies could show Germans a massive armored force in southeast England while concentrating the real invasion force in the southwest. The Germans would see both through their intelligence channels, but they would believe the visible force in the southeast near Dover was the main invasion threat because it was positioned at the logical crossing point to Calais. As May turned into June, German reconnaissance efforts intensified. Luftwaffe flights over England remained dangerous because Allied fighters controlled the skies, but German pilots made desperate high-speed runs whenever weather provided opportunities. On May 23rd, 3 German reconnaissance aircraft penetrated Allied air defenses and photographed positions across Kent before being driven off. The film showed the Canadian tank concentrations clearly. On May 30th, another German flight photographed the Dover area and captured images of the fake convoys positioned along coastal roads. Every photograph reinforced German belief that 1st Canadian Army and other Allied units were massing for an invasion of Calais. The impact showed up in specific, measurable German military decisions. On June 6th, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the German 15th Army remained in position defending Pas de Calais. That army included 18 full divisions, nearly 200,000 men. Among them were the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler with heavy Tiger tanks, and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend with Panther tanks. These were elite units with combat veterans and the best equipment Germany could provide. They stayed in position near Calais, weapons ready, eyes on the coast, waiting for the Canadian armored force they believed was preparing to cross from Dover. Their orders were explicit. The intelligence evidence showed massive tank concentrations in Kent. Normandy was likely a diversion. The real attack would come at Calais. Do not move until the actual threat materializes. On June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, German High Command held an urgent strategy meeting. Intelligence officers presented their latest analysis. Reconnaissance photographs from late May still showed Canadian tank concentrations in Kent. The units had not moved. Ground intelligence from agents reported continued activity around Dover. Radio intercepts suggested 1st United States Army Group remained in southeast England. The conclusion seemed inescapable. Normandy was a feint designed to draw German forces away from the real invasion corridor. The Canadians had not launched their attack yet because they were waiting for the right moment, probably waiting for German reserves to commit to Normandy before striking the weakly defended Calais sector. Hitler agreed completely with this assessment. He had been predicting the main invasion would come at Calais for months. The intelligence confirmed his strategic intuition. He ordered the 15th Army to remain in position. The Panzer Division stayed where they were, more than 300 kilometers from the actual fighting in Normandy. On June 13th, a full week into the battle for Normandy, the situation remained unchanged. German intelligence continued to report that Fusag and its Canadian tank units were still positioned in southeast England, still preparing, still threatening Calais. The inflatable tanks remained in their positions, still being photographed by occasional German reconnaissance flights, still looking real in every image. The Canadian crews maintaining the deception worked under enormous pressure. They knew Allied soldiers were dying on Normandy beaches. They knew their rubber tanks were the only thing keeping German panzers away from those beaches. Every morning they checked each inflatable for damage. Wind could tear the fabric. Rain could wash away the painted weathering that made them look real. They repaired tiers using rubber cement patches. They repainted mud patterns and oil stains. They moved tanks periodically to new positions and used bulldozers to create fresh track marks. They maintained the illusion with meticulous attention to detail, because one mistake, one inflatable that obviously looked fake in a German photograph, could unravel the entire deception. British intelligence monitored German communications constantly through their ultra-decryption program. The intercepted messages revealed something almost unbelievable. The Germans had not just fallen for the inflatable tank deception. They had built their entire defensive strategy around it. Every German intelligence report about Allied invasion plans mentioned the Canadian armoured concentrations in Kent. Every strategic assessment rated Calais as the more likely target than Normandy specifically, because of the tank strength shown in reconnaissance photographs. The Phantom Army had become more real to German commanders than the actual Allied forces fighting in France. The Germans trusted their reconnaissance photos completely because aerial photography had been reliable throughout the war. German photo analysts were among the best in the world. The idea that an entire armored force could be faked using inflatable decoys had never seriously occurred to them. By June 25th, 19 days after D-Day, the Normandy beachhead was secure. Allied forces had pushed inland, captured key towns including Carentan and Bayeux, and established strong defensive positions. The immediate danger of being pushed back into the sea had passed. Allied intelligence officers assessed what the Canadian inflatable deception had accomplished. They calculated that German reinforcement of Normandy had been delayed by at least 15 days, possibly as long as 3 weeks. During those crucial weeks, 2 full panzer divisions with approximately 400 real tanks sat idle 300 kilometers from the fighting, defending against rubber tanks filled with air. General Eisenhower, who had approved the Canadian inflatable tank program back in March, wrote about its impact in classified reports to the combined chiefs of staff. His assessment was direct and powerful. The dummy equipment deployed by Canadian forces in southeast England successfully fixed substantial German armored reserves in the Pas-de-Calais area throughout the critical initial phase of operations in Normandy. This deception was instrumental in allowing Allied forces to establish and expand the beachhead without facing the full weight of German panzer strength. The cost-benefit ratio of this deception operation was extraordinary. Military analysts later estimated that the inflatable deception, which cost roughly £7,000 in materials and manufacturing, had the same strategic effect as deploying 3 actual armored divisions, which would have cost over £40 million and required 15,000 additional soldiers. But the deception did not end with the beachhead. Canadian crews kept the inflatable tanks in position through July. They continued maintaining them, moving them periodically, creating the appearance that Fusag remained active and threatening. German reconnaissance flights continued photographing the positions when they could penetrate Allied air defenses. German intelligence kept analyzing the photos and reporting that Canadian tank units remained in Kent. It was not until July 29th, nearly 8 full weeks after D-Day, that German High Command finally accepted the truth. The massive tank force they had been watching and fearing for months did not exist. The hundreds of tanks in reconnaissance photographs were rubber decoys. The threat to Calais was imaginary. By the time Germans realized they had been fooled by inflatable tanks and fake convoys maintained by a few hundred Canadian soldiers, Allied armies had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. Paris would be liberated within a month. The war in Western Europe was effectively decided, and it had all started with Canadian soldiers in muddy English fields, inflating rubber tanks and making them look real enough to fool the cameras in German reconnaissance planes flying overhead. The inflatable tank technology pioneered by Canadian and British forces in 1944 did not disappear after D-Day. The techniques became classified military doctrine, studied and refined by intelligence agencies for decades. By 1952, NATO established formal training programs in physical battlefield deception, teaching new generations of soldiers how to deploy dummy equipment that could fool aerial reconnaissance. The materials improved significantly over the years. Early Cold War inflatables used stronger synthetic rubbers that could withstand harsh weather. By the 1960s, designers added metal components that created radar signatures matching real vehicles, making the decoys effective against electronic detection as well as visual reconnaissance. But the fundamental principle remained exactly what Corporal Henderson and Lieutenant Thornton had demonstrated in Kent. Make the enemy see what you want them to see, and they will position their forces based on that false picture. Corporal Tommy Henderson went home to Winnipeg when the war ended in 1945. He traded his uniform for civilian clothes and returned to his pre-war job as a construction worker. In a small ceremony at Canadian Forces Base, Shiloh, that fewer than 30 people attended, he received the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal, along with hundreds of other veterans. There was no special recognition for his deception work. The citation mentioned service with Canadian engineering units in England and France, but gave no details about inflatable tanks or phantom armies. The Canadian government kept the full story classified for decades. They did not want other countries knowing the details of how the deception had worked. The techniques were too valuable to reveal. So Henderson kept the secret, went back to building houses and office buildings, and lived a quiet life in Manitoba. He died in 1987 at the age of 71. His obituary in the Winnipeg Free Press mentioned his construction career and his wartime service with the Royal Canadian Engineers, but said nothing specific about the Ghost Army. The complete truth about his contribution did not become public until 1996, when the British government declassified the Operation Fortitude records, and historians began piecing together Canada's crucial role. That long secrecy meant Henderson and thousands of other Canadian soldiers who worked on the inflatable deceptions never received proper recognition during their lifetimes. No monuments were built to honor them. No history books mentioned their names in the decades immediately after the war. They were not celebrated as heroes because the public did not know what they had done. Most of the soldiers who deployed and maintained the dummy tanks returned to ordinary civilian jobs. Some worked in construction. Others became farmers or factory workers. A few stayed in the Canadian military, but even they could never tell anyone about the operation that had mattered most. Henderson rarely discussed the war, even with his family. When his grandchildren asked what he did during the fighting, he would smile and say he worked with tanks. That was technically true, but it missed the extraordinary impact those rubber tanks had on the invasion's success. But the technology he helped deploy kept proving its worth long after he returned to civilian life. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Israeli armored forces used inflatable tank decoys extensively in the Sinai Desert. They positioned dummy tanks in forward positions while real armored units moved to flanking positions under cover of darkness. Egyptian forces, relying on aerial reconnaissance and forward observers, reported massive Israeli tank concentrations where only inflatables sat. Egyptian artillery units expended thousands of shells destroying rubber decoys, while real Israeli tanks attacked from unexpected directions. The tactic worked because it followed exactly the principle the Canadians had proven in 1944. Control what the enemy's reconnaissance sees, control where the enemy commits his forces. In 1982, during the Falklands War, British forces deployed inflatable helicopters and vehicles on ships approaching the islands. Argentine reconnaissance aircraft photographed these decoys and reported them as genuine military assets. Argentine commanders allocated anti-aircraft resources to defend against helicopter assaults that were actually coming from different directions. The inflatable decoys, descendants of the technology developed for D-Day, helped British forces achieve tactical surprise, despite operating at the end of a supply line that stretched 8,000 miles from England. The technology became incredibly sophisticated by the end of the 20th century. In 1991, during the Gulf War, coalition forces deployed more than 300 inflatable decoys across Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. These were not simple rubber shells like the 1944 versions. Modern inflatables included radar reflectors made from metal mesh that created electronic signatures matching real tanks. They had thermal generators that created heat signatures visible to infrared sensors. They even had remote-controlled systems that could move antennas and turrets slightly, simulating the small movements of real armored vehicles. Iraqi forces, using Soviet-made reconnaissance satellites and aerial surveillance, identified these decoy positions as real coalition armor. Iraqi artillery and missile units targeted the Phantom forces, wasting thousands of rounds on targets that did not exist. Coalition commanders later estimated that inflatable decoys absorbed approximately 40% of Iraqi indirect fire during the ground campaign, allowing real coalition units to maneuver with significantly fewer casualties. In 2003, during the invasion of Iraq, American and British forces continued using inflatable deceptions. They deployed dummy artillery batteries and tank platoons to draw Iraqi attention away from actual attack routes. The Iraqis, having learned from 1991 that coalition forces used decoys, sent ground scouts to verify targets before engaging. But this caution slowed Iraqi response times, giving coalition forces additional hours to establish positions. The deception worked even when the enemy knew deception was possible, because confirming whether a target was real or fake required time and resources. The technology proved itself again in 2022 when Ukraine faced Russian invasion. Ukrainian forces, desperately outnumbered and outgunned, used inflatable decoys extensively. They deployed dummy HIMARS rocket launchers, inflatable tanks, and fake artillery positions throughout contested areas. Russian forces, relying heavily on satellite reconnaissance and drone surveillance, identified these positions and struck them with expensive precision-guided missiles. Intelligence analysts later estimated that Russia expended hundreds of Kaliber cruise missiles, each costing approximately $6 million, destroying inflatable targets that cost a few $1,000s each. Ukrainian soldiers moving the inflatable decoys between positions reported that Russian forces sometimes hit the same dummy target multiple times before realizing it was fake. The Ghost Army concept, born in Kent in 1944 with Canadian soldiers inflating rubber tanks, was still saving lives and conserving military resources 80 years later. The broader lesson from Canada's Ghost Army went far beyond inflatable tanks and military deception. It revealed something fundamental about modern warfare and strategic thinking. Traditional military power focuses on building more weapons, training more soldiers, deploying more firepower. Those elements matter, but the Canadian inflatable deception proved that perception management could be equally important. If you could make the enemy believe you had forces in a particular location, they would allocate real forces to counter that perceived threat. Whether your forces were real or made of rubber and air became irrelevant. The enemy's decisions were based on what their intelligence systems reported, not on objective reality. You could multiply your effective combat power without manufacturing additional real equipment, simply by controlling what the enemy's reconnaissance assets observed. This insight extended far beyond tanks and battlefields. In the information age, the side that controls the narrative often achieves strategic objectives regardless of underlying physical strength. During the Cold War, both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces maintained elaborate deception programs. Entire phantom divisions existed on paper and in carefully staged photographs. Real military units were hidden while dummy installations drew enemy attention. The cost of maintaining a deception force was a tiny fraction of the cost of maintaining equivalent real forces, but the deception forced adversaries to spread their defenses thin, commit reconnaissance assets, and plan for threats that did not exist. Today, military deception has evolved into domains that Corporal Henderson could never have imagined. Modern warfare includes cyberspace deceptions, where fake network traffic suggests military communications that do not exist. Satellite imagery can be manipulated to show troop buildups that are not real. Social media accounts spread false information about unit locations and capabilities. Deepfake technology can create video evidence of military movements that never happened. The medium has changed from rubber tanks to digital phantoms, but the principle remains exactly what the Canadians proved in 1944. Make the enemy see false information through channels they trust, and they will act on that false information as if it were true. The story of Canada's Ghost Army carries one final critical lesson about innovation and unconventional thinking. The most effective solutions often come from unexpected places and unusual perspectives. Lieutenant Thornton was not a career military officer or a weapons engineer. He was a theater stage manager who understood visual illusion and audience perception. Corporal Henderson was not a tank commander. He was a construction worker who understood materials and structures. When traditional military approaches to deception failed, these unconventional soldiers succeeded by applying civilian skills to military problems. The generals asked how to hide real forces or build better physical fortifications. Thornton and Henderson asked what German reconnaissance cameras could actually detect and how to create images that cameras would interpret as genuine military forces. That shift in perspective, that willingness to think about the enemy's observation systems rather than just physical deployment of forces, made all the difference. The young Canadians who worked in muddy Kent fields inflating rubber tanks remind us that victory takes many forms. They never fired weapons in combat. They never stormed beaches under fire. They never flew dangerous bombing missions, but their work with air compressors and painted canvas, creating phantom armies that existed only in German photographs and intelligence assessments, saved thousands of Allied lives and helped determine the outcome of the war's most crucial battle. In a world where information shapes decisions and perception drives strategy, those invisible warriors demonstrated that the most powerful weapons are sometimes the ones that change what the enemy believes rather than destroying what the enemy has. Henderson and his fellow soldiers understood what many commanders initially did not grasp. Modern warfare is not fought only with steel and explosives. It is fought with information and perception. If you can control what the enemy's intelligence systems report, you can control where the enemy positions his forces. If you can make the enemy see phantom threats, you can draw real forces away from actual battlefields. The inflatable tanks existed only as rubber shells filled with air, but they kept 2 German panzer divisions away from Normandy for 7 critical weeks. Sometimes the weapons you cannot fire are the most effective ones. Sometimes the armies made of rubber and lies win more important victories than armies made of steel and bullets. The Ghost Army was never real, but it helped win the most important battle of the 20th century. And that makes it one of the most successful military units in history, even though it existed only in photographs and German imagination.